Good morning. Oops, this isn't. Good morning, everybody. I'm Jody Schneider. I'm president of the FCC. Thank you for waking up early and joining us this morning. Before I introduce our speaker, Ernest Bauer with BowerGroupAsia, I wanted to tell you about a few upcoming events here at the club. As you know, we've been doing a lot around press freedom, particularly given the protests this summer, and we have a luncheon panel tomorrow. I don't know, I don't see Diddy, I don't know if we're totally sold out. We may have a few spots left, so do check with the front office. It's going to be on the protests and press freedom with people who are on the front lines covering, have been covering the demonstration, so it should be fascinating. So if there's room, try to sign up if you haven't already. That'll be tomorrow luncheon. And then on Tuesday the 13th, next Tuesday, we're having the third in our, what we're calling a series of breakfast briefings. These are workshops designed to help us promote press freedom in Hong Kong by being a forum for training journalists. As this very remarkable summer continues. And that topic will be on the Hong Kong protest, a workshop on digital security. So please join us for that as well, and there will be announcements of other workshops in coming weeks. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, who will be speaking about how the China-U.S. trade dynamic impacts investment and supply chains in Asia. A remarkably timely topic for anybody who's been keeping in touch with these issues. And basically, with effects of far beyond the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and China, the trade dispute has accelerated pre-existing trends in and resulted in economic production across Indo-Pacific and shifted elements of the global supply chains out of China and into other Asian markets. Ernest Bauer, our speaker, is going to talk about that and some recent trade developments, and we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A. He is the founder and CEO of BowerGroupAsia and founder and chairman of BowerGroupAsia Inc., which is pioneering the field of digital advocacy and the use of artificial intelligence as a policy and business tool across Asia. He helped start the U.S. ASEAN Business Council in the mid-'80s and served for a decade as president of the private business group comprised of America's leading companies in Southeast Asia. And he also created a chair for Southeast Asia at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. I give you Ernest Bauer.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for Jody for the invitation. Thanks Didier and the staff for keeping up this beautiful place. You're really lucky to have such a great clubhouse to convene in, and I'm very fortunate to be here with you today. I really appreciate it. I flew in on Cathay Pacific on Monday morning somehow. I don't know how my plane landed, but I understood there was only one runway later in the morning, so I feel lucky to be here, just logistically lucky to be here. And I had no idea when we agreed to do this talk that things would be this poignant and intense in Hong Kong. So I think it's an interesting time to be on the ground, and I really look forward to the give and take after I make a couple remarks. I'd love to get some feedback from all of you as we try to understand what's happening in the what feels like the fight for the soul of Hong Kong here in the streets of your city. But I'm here to talk a little bit about the U.S.-China trade dynamics, how that's affecting how companies and countries think about the future, and how it's impacting supply chains. And I think it's all relative, or it all relates, I should say, to the politics of the day here. So hopefully, not taking you out of the current milieu, but adding some context and texture to it. What I thought I'd do is just give you some ideas about what's happening from our perspective. And our perspective, or my perspective, is we're sort of in the mines when it comes to how companies are dealing with the trade conflict between the United States and China, between Japan and Korea, within ASEAN, and then, many other dynamics, India's rise. We have 120 people in 22 countries across Asia, and we work for about 100 of the world's top companies. A lot of them are American because we're based in Washington, but our center of gravity is really Asia. So that mindset, or the mindset that I'm coming and talking to you from, is one of, we're working with the companies who are switching their supply chains around and out of China into Southeast Asia. We're dealing with the companies who are trying to think about where to put people and money and facilities, and they are being directly affected every day by Donald Trump's tweets and Xi Jinping's doubling down on the China response. Structure of trade and investment flows in Asia has, as you know, has always been dynamic and in constant flux. But what we're seeing now is the restructuring of those, the most important and significant restructuring of those flows so far this century. And I would say countries, companies, and societies are really struggling to respond to that change. The most significant adjustment, in my view, is how the U.S. and China adapt to the new realities that China, and China will be probably up until about 2050, and then India later in the century, become the world's largest economies. The response to the United States, I would say, is not surprising. And just a quick sidebar here, because Jody, I know, did politics and trade in Washington for years. But the fact of the matter is that the United States is responsible for some of the brinksmanship that we're facing right now. Well, the United States benefited from globalization. That the benefit was not widely shared. I think politicians and company leaders didn't sell the idea of trade and globalization to Americans. They didn't explain it enough. And even a communicator like Barack Obama, when he was president, was able to really talk to people. When he was promoting TPP, even the Democrats in his own party who were sucking it up and trying to support him, they couldn't do it because the president himself wasn't willing to risk talking about Asia and trade and the importance of that to Americans' future, because it was a political bad word. Trade, Asia, China, these things don't sell, and they don't win elections in the United States. And in large part, and it wasn't just Obama. This is not a partisan statement. The Bushes before him didn't do it either. And so what the result of that is that it's where Donald Trump came from. And I think that's an important part of what you have to understand now is that there is a lot of resentment in the United States about the lack of impact on people's lives of globalization, or the perceived lack of impact. They feel left out. And I think Trump, using digital technology, took advantage of that. And from that anger and resentment came people like Peter Navarro, and to some extent Bob Lighthizer, who's our U.S. trade representative. And they were able to sort of radicalize the United States in terms of its view on trade and China's move. I think anybody who really understood Asia, and I know most of you live here, work here, knows that one of the China's rise as an economic powerhouse in the region was inevitable in many ways. It was a huge country in the center of Asia that the rest of Asia needs to succeed economically, but I don't think the rest of Asia wants China to be making the rules and imposing those rules and questioning others' sovereignty. So the South China Sea, what's happening here in Hong Kong, we could point to other instances around the region, is causing a lot of concern among other countries. And so as we recognize China's growth, I think what's happening is China is becoming, the United States has understood that China has become a competitor, But we went through the same cycle with Japan in the late 80s and the early 90s, and there was a lot of similarities in that competition, but there's a lot of differences too. The Japanese didn't have a regional navy that was forward deployed. They weren't challenging sovereignty of neighbors. They did want to set new standards, as the Chinese do. But the Americans are taking China on in a new way, which I think is causing a lot of angst, and it's resulting in a lot of change. But regardless of how the U.S.-China trade dispute ends, what's really happening right now in terms of business and supply chain shifts is an acceleration of pre-existing trends. Countries are really not faced with a black and white choice between China and the United States, and they will put their own interests first. I think the current situation is driving a trend of localization, or you could say nationalization, anti-globalization, and this mindset as a policy motivation is possibly a trap that could undermine regional security and prosperity if taken too far. I personally think market economics and sort of economies of scale will make a comeback at some point. The question is how far we'll go towards nationalization before we move in that direction. And I would say, I appreciate Jody mentioning my time at CSIS, which is one of Washington's most important foreign policy and national security think tanks. And people wondered why I was there, building a Southeast Asia chair. But the truth is that when you think about the future of Asia and you think about security, at the very foundation of long-term sustainable security in Asia will be economic integration within the Indo-Pacific. And if that's not done well, there really is a chance that we'll have a confrontation, physical military confrontation between countries, and that's dangerous. And I think we're at a point right now where it could be an inflection point, where you have countries thinking about their interests, thinking about and explicitly telling their populations about their own interests, not global interests. And if that goes further, I think we have real concerns. I personally think that is a lot of what spooked the market the other day. A lot of the trade and currency language has already been priced in, and I think that's why the market bounced back so quickly today after moderating voices took over to some extent last night. But investors are considering alternative approaches in Asia, and companies are reshaping their supply chains to reflect these new realities and protect their competitive futures. There's a fast expanding understanding in boardrooms across the United States, Europe, and Asia that companies that Asia's under-resourced relative to North America and Europe, particularly in areas such as government engagement, stakeholder relations, community engagement, training, and sustainability. In other words, you take a large beer company that's operating out of Europe or the United States, and you look at the people, just the numbers that they have in dealing with policy issues and governments in the United States and Europe, the ratio is about 10 to 1 from what they have in Asia. So I think, well, everyone sees Asia as the future of growth. The companies haven't switched their resourcing to the region yet. And I think this is causing a little bit of an overlap, an under-resourcing of how companies are viewing this issue. And that's important because when you think about some of the stopgap measures that would have buffeted a U.S.-China confrontation like this in the past, probably the biggest and most important one was the U.S. private sector's lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C. And I have to tell you, the American companies are not coming to China's to save China this time. They have been treated to about a decade of regulatory extortion. They've really had a hard time dealing in China. We could go into detail on that if you want to. But a lot of the companies, there's a few who tried, but the broad constituency supporting the Chinese in a trade war are basically gone now in the United States. And that leaves us with Trump and Navarro and his team taking a pretty radical stance, using language that, well, I think if Hillary Clinton had won this election, we'd still be in sort of a confrontation with China. The Americans weren't going to stand back and allow China to sort of go ahead and make the rules and pretend that it's a developing economy anymore. But I think you'd have sort of a more diplomatic approach. It wouldn't feel this edgy. And I'm not sure that Trump is using his foreign policy advisors and other diplomatic levers that most American presidents have used. And that's creating a lot of angst in Beijing and other capitals around the region. And companies, I think I think it's a mistake, but I think companies are sitting back a little bit, either unable or unwilling to step in and moderate that approach. But for companies to succeed in Asia and to prosper, they need to invest more comprehensively, and I think we're seeing that. So that the top tier of companies are dealing with this situation now by going local themselves. And what do I mean by that? They're now creating local narratives. If you have a global brand, you have to be able to say, what does that branding message mean to Indonesians or to Malaysians? What does it mean to Indians or Thais? And they're using a new toolkit, including creating their own foreign policies. I think there's a real delinkage of sovereign identity in top companies. They aren't leading them as American companies or German companies. They're sort of international entities who work locally with local people. And the way they're doing this is really interesting. And I don't know if everyone's aware of it yet, but Jody mentioned that we'd created a digital company. And I think digital is really leading the way here. It used to be that in this line of work, when companies were worried about where supply chains were headed or what governments were going to do on trade wars or making new regulatory policies, that the blocking and tackling would be engaging elite stakeholders, the minister, the director general, the prime minister, trade minister, finance minister, and making a case for why this policy or that policy was the best choice for the country. Now, to be effective, companies need to engage groups of people. And the way they do that is with big data and AI, or artificial intelligence. So they buy big data, they sift it, and they try to understand what's important to people. They tailor their messaging to local audiences, who then have more influence with policymakers. And that is the most effective way, combined with the old blocking and tackling. You can't forget that. But that's the most effective way that companies are dealing with the current situation. And I think it's a trend it's underreported, Jody. I think it's something that's changing the game. And the reason they're doing it is that politicians like Donald Trump and Duterte in the Philippines and the people that won the governor's election in Jakarta are using a handful of political consultants who do this digital work the same. So I have to tell you that, in Washington, I get visits all the time from politicians from Asia asking me to introduce them to Obama's digital team or Trump's digital team. And people like Corey Lewandowski are showing up in Malaysia, when I'm there. So we know that, companies recognize it, and so they're starting to, you've got to play the game to understand that and drive some of the discussion. Looking back at the dispute, I've got a lot of notes here. I think I'm actually sort of interested in what you guys are interested, but I think what we can talk about is how companies are actually adapting to this. I mean, geopolitically and economically, I think most boardrooms around the world have realized that the center of gravity for the 21st century will be where the Indian and Pacific Oceans meet. That means China is key. Asia's the most important region in the world, but it's also fraught because we haven't invested enough before now to understand those trends completely. So recent growth numbers out of both the U.S. and China amid this dispute show that, well, the continued economic standoff has not yet plunged the world into a recession. Both the Chinese and the American economies are performing below potential. And you'll read a lot of headlines about countries in Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam, to some extent the Philippines, and some countries in South Asia that were benefiting from supply chain redirection. I mean, we're literally helping, particularly tech companies, speed up 5-year plans for investment outside of China into a 1-year rush job that's, pumping up industrial parks. We're asking for things from governments that are sort of ridiculous to ask in such a short time frame, but there's a great rush of investment that would have gone into China that's going into Southeast Asia and to some extent South Asia, or trying to go into India and Indonesia, but those places are very hard to move quickly in. So I think we see a lot of a change there. But those markets are suffering as well because regional growth rates are beginning to decline due to the slowdown in the U.S. and Chinese markets. And so they're being affected by not only the slower trade flows or disrupted trade flows, but now with the introduction of the currency discussion, there are going to be some very hard math problems for central bank governors from the ASEAN countries in South Asia trying to figure out how to deal with the situation. Jody, I think what I'd like to do is I'd like to stop there and sort of dig into some questions. We can talk about how individual countries and companies are dealing with the situation. We can talk about the geopolitics, the politics in Washington, in Beijing. But I think maybe I've given you a sense of sort of what we're groping with here, what we're thinking about, how companies are trying to deal with this. And then I think some Q&A might be more fun than me rattling on. Can I join you?
Sure, yeah. So I'm going to ask the first question. So you were talking about how things have changed now, maybe kind of irreparably, with China and the U.S. Do you think that if there was a Democrat in the White House, if the Democrats do win the White House in the 2020 election, would President Trump's successor likely come down harder on China, or would it revert perhaps to how it was before? Would we see the lessening of this trade war? Do you think this is now forever?
Yeah, I think that, and I think I referred to this, trade is not going to have a good hearing in the United States for a long time to come. We've hosted leaders from Australia, around Southeast Asia. Is that good? Better? Around Southeast Asia, and a lot of them are coming to Washington and asking if the question you just asked, if a Democrat's elected, is this going to get better? And on trade, the answer is no. There's no core constituency for trade that has its act together in the United States right now. The companies are not using their money and their capabilities to lobby effectively for trade. The politicians are running away from it. And I think Hillary Clinton would have been as tough on China as Trump is, but would have done it in a much more diplomatic way. So I think the Chinese actually knew that. So she was signaling clearly, and that she meant it, that things were going to get, that the Americans weren't going to accept the status quo from China. I think the issue with Trump is that he's doing it in a much more confrontational way, using sort of real estate negotiating tactics and global trade talks. We're in the middle of that experiment. Unfortunately, we're in the middle of that experiment at a time when global, as I tried to make the point, global and Asia's economic order is absolutely being restructured right now. So leadership on this, I should say, I guess maybe this is leadership. I mean, I think some companies think Trump is doing what had to be done in confronting China. I think most companies think that, well, that might be true. The way he's doing it is very dangerous, and they worry about it.
Okay, we have time for questions now. When you ask a question, could you please let us know, give us your name and your affiliation, if any, and there are microphones here. Yeah, here.
Thank you. I have lots of questions. My name's Laurel West. I'm with the Economist Group. I'll just throw one at you to start now. You mentioned earlier about the exodus and the exploration of Southeast Asia and the fact that India and Indonesia are very slow-going and difficult to just jump into. Who do you see as the front runner to receive this investment that is being diverted from China?
Well, there's no question. If you look at the numbers, Vietnam has benefited more than anyone else. I think in a lot of ways because they look like a small China that's not China. The Vietnamese also have a sort of a singularity of decision making. So the government decided that for its existentially for its own national security, that it needed to catch up economically, and so that phenomenon for the last 10 years has meant rocketing growth for Vietnam, and I think the companies have found they can get quick answers from the Vietnamese. But the issue is executing on those. So Vietnamese infrastructure, the talent pool to be able to execute on some of these, have people work and run some of these facilities that companies are trying to put into Vietnam. There's serious shortages of that. So I think Vietnam's almost full. They're working quickly to expand that capacity and train people, investing like crazy in education, doing a lot of the right things, quite frankly. So after Vietnam, I think the Philippines has done pretty well, Malaysia and Thailand to some extent, and I think when every company thinks about, Jesus, I've got to do work, I've got to invest outside of China. You just look at they're mostly economists, right, who think about this. They look at the next biggest countries in Asia, and they want to go to India and Indonesia. But that, as I mentioned, both those countries are also going through this phenomenon that I mentioned of sort of localization and make in India, data localization, content rules. So it makes it hard to put money to work in India and Indonesia as fast as you can in Vietnam and some of the other Southeast Asian countries.
Other questions? Yeah, right here.
From GavCal Capital. So earlier you mentioned that the corporates that you speak to all see China and India as kind of the long-term sources of demand. But when you think about what is going on in the United States and other Western countries about seemingly pulling away from China, what is your view of what the end game is in terms of, if that's where the future is, are they simply trying to get greater access, or is it really about trying to longer term localize economies?
Yeah, I would say generally that the thinking is that everyone wants China to succeed economically, but they want China to play by the rules of the region. And so I think the hope that the Americans can convince the Chinese to do that that's wearing a bit thin. Certainly not under this regime. I don't think that Xi Jinping, because of Chinese politics, is not going to be able to sort of, bend to Donald Trump and Peter Navarro and Bob Lighthizer. So I think people are sort of frustrated because it's not likely that China's going to change soon. I think there's more hope, and this gets a little fluffier because I think boardrooms and defense planners and people like that don't love this kind of soft power, but what's probably more likely to happen is that China will recognize that because they've run into the rock of an American government that won't put up with this anymore, that what they're going to have to do is convince the region to expand trade. So RCEP and the East Asia Summit, these models are almost like expanding an ASEAN type cooperative effort, lowest common denominator, slow shaping of rules. That's what's happening in Asia. And I think companies are very impatient about that. It's not going to happen fast enough certainly for quarterly reports or annual returns. And the question is, will China even play by those rules, or will they try to force other countries to sort of follow them? And the rest of Southeast Asia, I spent a lot of time with the people that lead these countries at the prime minister level, minister level. They do not want China to dictate the rules of how trade and investment flows, a little less sovereignty and security rules will be made. And the Americans, even with Trump, are a little further away, a little safer in that sense. So there's a lot of thinking about how Japan and India and the ASEAN countries can engage China and shape China behind a very strong and maybe too aggressive American push right now. But the end game, to answer your question, is nobody wants to leave China. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying American companies are out of China. They're just putting new money, new investments in other places to hedge. And then very practically, because it's hard to get product out of China into the United States, which is a major market right now. So part of this is short-term tactical, part of it is long-term strategic. Does that make sense?
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Shelley Banjo. I work with Jody at Bloomberg News. You mentioned that you were trying to work with companies to accelerate their 5-year plans into 1-year pushes. How do you practically do that, and is that possible? Because for a long time people said, oh, it's just so impossible to move our production out of China, and then within a year you saw people move production out of China.
Yeah, I mean, I think anything's impossible until you have to do it. So it's kind of like Mike Tyson's quote, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. Companies got punched in the face. And so it's a fight then. What are you going to do when you have to move things? So you have to make decisions. Companies are really thinking about decisions like, do I leave China? Do I sell a majority stake of my China holdings to a Chinese partner and hold 40% and try to benefit from, marginally from that growth, but then focus elsewhere for my organic growth? Or do I try to put new investment and accelerate plans and build the next plant or the next 3 plants in Vietnam, Malaysia, and India? And I think most are doing the latter. They're thinking about a blend of strategies to survive China, to this chapter of China's development. They want to be part of it. They want to have a long-term relationship there. So I think they're trying to retain some level of a narrative so that when China is back and playing by the rules and a little easier to work in, that they didn't leave. But it's very hard. It's very hard to manage that right now. But I have to say, and we've been involved directly in this, it is possible to build new plants in the Philippines and Vietnam and Malaysia within almost a year's time in some sectors, depending on what the what you're talking about. Not easy, expensive, hard.
Richard Ward, Ward Associates. What trends do you see now in Chinese outbound investment in terms of geography and sector, and how do you see that evolving?
Thanks for asking. That was something I had prepared to talk about, but I didn't want to go too long in this format, especially with a room full of people who know what they're talking about. So, huge Chinese investment is leaving China in particularly the metals sector, technology, some in processing, agriculture processing, and others. It's going south to Southeast Asia. It's looking at West Asia. The Chinese have been particularly focusing on countries where they can use political leverage to back up commercial investments. So Pakistan, Cambodia, Indonesia, they've done pretty well around Southeast Asia. And some of that's, again, tactical to beat the tariffs, basically. Some of it's tactical in another way. I mean, young Chinese tech entrepreneurs really like working in Singapore because it's easier to raise money. They find the environment a little more creative and open than they do in China. And that's interesting. Those numbers aren't big, but the potential is enormous. So that's where we see, big numbers of new Chinese investment headed south. But if you look at total investment, the Americans and the Japanese still dwarf Chinese investment in South and Southeast Asia. I mean, it's not even close. Even new investment, the Japanese have really stepped up. And I think Japanese have 27% of all new greenfield investment over the last 2 years in Southeast Asia, where the Chinese have 14%. But if you look at total investment, I actually put this stuff together for you guys. You look at total investment, and this is outside of intra-ASEAN investment. Thailand, Japan is the #1 investor, head and shoulders. Singapore, the United States is the top investor. Vietnam, Korea is the top investor. Philippines, Japan, and the U.S. are sort of 1 and 2, pretty close. And the gap is narrowing between China and Japan, most closely in Indonesia, which I thought was pretty interesting.
We have time for one more question, so make it a good one. Anybody have a last question? Oh, okay, right over here. Thank you.
Tony Watson. I'm with the Hong Kong Society of Financial Analysts, the local CFA Institute affiliate. Actually, 2 questions. You can answer them whether or not, up to you. Number 1, Belt and Road Initiative. How is that factored into the reconfiguration of supply chains? And number 2, peripheral South Asian countries. I'm thinking Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan. How do they factor in, if at all? Thanks.
Yeah, I think BRI has not proved to be a big factor in supply chain investment yet, but it depends on how you define BRI. So I think it's being defined pretty widely and broadly by different groups in China and around here. So even some people have tried to explain to me that Hong Kong is the most significant BRI hub. And I guess that's possible. That's a way to think about it. But I think that's not the way the rest of Asia looks at it. I think BRI feels like it feels like sort of a loose Chinese construct that expresses their intent, that China's intent to invest in the region, and it's I think it gets conflated with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank sometimes, which is also a misnomer because that the Chinese actually did something I think pretty impressive there by forming that institution, and well, the Japanese stepped in and others stepped in to make it make the governance rules pretty useful. But I think the BRI is most important because it indicates China's clear intent over time to build infrastructure and invest in the region. I think that's a good thing for everybody, even American companies who might see themselves as competing with the Chinese. I think building infrastructure in Asia is good for everybody, and I think that's one lesson we learned from the sort of confrontation we had with the Japanese in the 80s and 90s. So I don't know if I'm sort of counterculture on that one, but BRI is okay. And I think the countries that you mentioned, this is a really good story. I mean, a really interesting story, I think, where the Pakistan in particular, Sri Lanka actually very interesting, Nepal not so much, but the Chinese are using their leverage to drive and get new projects and invest in these countries. They're also doing a lot of it through loans that don't make a lot of sense commercially. And the countries, and I think what the Chinese have to worry about is, yeah, they might be able to force a lot of money into these places, and Cambodia, I would add, and put a lot of money to work in the near term, but it is causing real resentment. So, I was in Phnom Penh a couple months ago, and people there are saying, please, bring some American money here. We're completely overbalanced by the Chinese. They're the only ones who are coming, and they're really worried about it. And it's going to cause political anti-Chinese backlash that the Chinese companies will have to worry about, and it will create levels of risk and leveraging in their projects that I don't think they've factored in a commercial way like American companies or European companies might. And that's going to cost them a lot of money in the long run. And I think when you talk to really smart Japanese bankers, for instance, they sort of remember the 90s too, and they're like, yeah, we bought Pebble Beach and parts of New York, and we ended up having to sell them back. We're not going to do that again, and the Chinese are doing that now. So this is great. Sell them all sorts of stuff, and then it'll be back on the market in a couple of years. And I think there's a lot of people on Wall Street who actually are looking at that as well, to be honest with you.
We're going to let one more question of board member discretion.
Thank you. Kin Ming Liu, and Associate Governor. Since you just arrived from Washington, I'm curious what people in Washington are thinking of Hong Kong these days. Thank you.
Well, the first answer is, everyone is, sending notes. Be careful. Did you land in the war zone? Is the tear gas in your gin and tonic? And that always happens, right? Because the news, the New York Times and CNN, and people report they show the worst clips of the guys beating each other or coming over the fence with poles and stuff like that. But I think you have it's a good question because you've got real concern there. And I worry that some of our congressmen, for instance, who get really interested and focused because of interest groups and reading headlines, they might overdo the reaction to Hong Kong, and it might hurt Hong Kong people and businesses. So I think we have to be careful that that when those guys think about how to react to this and react against the Hong Kong government, I think that would be that's the tone on the Hill right now, that it's managed well. And I worry about that because the current administration, in my view, has sort of purposely weakened, diplomacy and intelligence and State Department, and I'm not sure they're using all those things like former presidents and the White Houses used to do. So whether the White House is going to stand up to, push by Rubio or other interested members of Congress on some of this stuff might mean some ugly surgery gets done on policy that might not be too constructive. So that's the main thing at the policy level I worry about. And I think for most people who don't know Hong Kong too well, it looks like the wheels are coming off here, to be honest with you. And I think there's a little bit of an overreaction. This happens a lot. But I also have to say that I didn't think it was, I thought they were overdoing it a lot until I spent a couple of days here. And now I actually think Hong Kong is, I wrote in the book here when I signed into the FCC, I wonder whether this is like the battle, we're witnessing the battle for the soul of Hong Kong. And it sounds a little extreme, I guess, but something's different this time. It feels like, and that's why I hope I can talk to some of you before I leave here, and I'm having good discussions around the city. I don't know what's really going on. I mean, the fact that 16-year-olds and middle-aged people are standing out in the streets when they could be arrested for rioting and face possibly a 10-year term, like they're still coming out there for these riots. I mean, or not riots, sorry, protests. That's amazing. So people are upset, right? They're upset about something. And I have to say I'm very, I'm humble enough to know that I don't know the answer, and I'm very interested to understand more. But I'd love if anyone had a comment on that they could share with Jody, maybe you or somebody would share a comment on that. Would be very helpful to me.
Well, join me in thanking our speaker. And we have a few FCC gifts. Including our gift bag. If any of you don't have the gift bag, the FCC bags, we are selling them downstairs. Thank you all, and please join us for future events. Thank you.
Hey, how are you? Thanks for the question.
Just my boat.
Ernie. Yeah. Yeah. Good timing. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it is the I'm sorry, I just want to ask you about India. That's my personal passion there.
Yeah.
What do you see going on there? I saw yesterday saying
Our side, yeah. I think the Indians are it'll be very hard to get our side done with the Indians in it. And what we're trying to understand how hard the Chinese are pushing to get them out.